You're listening to I Love It When, and I'm your host, Mo. I'm a speaker, coach, and connector. You're in the right place if you're looking for some inspiration and you're ready to truly embrace who you are. My intention with this podcast is to help you see that you are so much more powerful than you realize. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of I Love It When. I'm your host, Mo. And on today's episode, we have a new friend of mine by the name of Matt Young. He's with Newcastle Oracle. And I met Matt at one of the local MIWI fairs. MIWI stands for Metaphysical Wellness Fair, and they're organized by Lorelei Shimayo. And if you go to miwifairs.com, you can learn more about if you're in the area somewhere in the Pacific Northwest and you want to attend one and meet Matt or anybody else that I've talked about on many of my episodes in person. They're often held in Linwood, Everett, Bellevue, Olympia. They were just down in Portland last weekend. And so Lorelei's been working on growing these fairs for quite a while now. So I was introduced to Matt through my friend Crystal Novak, who I've had on the podcast. And I was immediately intrigued by all of the different stories he has from the healings that have happened around the world with Matt. And so I met him, went and met him at one of the fairs, and immediately had a reading with him because, as many of you know, if you've been to any of my retreats or been on my podcast, listened to my podcast, but especially my retreats and the classes where I bring in practitioners that I've met, I absolutely use my discernment, meaning that I don't invite just anybody to come to my retreats. They go through a bit of a vetting system. And that's really important to me because, like we talk about on this episode, there are a lot of people who heal or who claim that they heal, but just like with any other industry, right? Like when you're going to the dentist or you're going to the doctor, you want to make sure that you vet that person and that you have a bit of trust with them, right? Before you trust them with your health. And so I treat everybody in the metaphysical realm the same way. Before I get a reading with them or before I would ever introduce them to any of my friends or family or colleagues or clients, I want to vet them. So I had a one-on-one session with Matt, and then I went to, I think, 2 or 3 now of his sessions where he did some classes through the MIWI fairs that you can attend either for free or for like $20. It's really, really cheap. And you go and you can hear him share some of his stories. And in a couple of the sessions, he would share what his process is for healing people. And then we would see it happen. Like the last hour of the class, he would do healings on anybody who was there and run energy on people. So I'm having him on the podcast because I really want to share his story with all of you. And my goal, as it is with my podcast in general, is to really expose my audience to people who I believe will widen your perspective and help you gain more awareness as to just how powerful you are. Because I think one of the things that I've realized in my life so far is we are so much more powerful than we realize. And so I have spent a lot of my life, my working life, creating opportunities for people to realize their power. That's really important to me. So here's the 411 on Matt. Matt Young is an international speaker, healer, oracle, author, coach, and minister who travels the world empowering, activating, and releasing people into their destiny through teaching, activations, and practical, life-changing demonstrations of power, love, and healing. He is known for incredible accuracy in intuitive readings over the last 30 years. He has a deep understanding of science related to religion and the metaphysical world and can explain things in a way that brings significant life change to people. He teaches all ages and all backgrounds. He has coached highly educated and successful people all around the world. Finally, he is the founder of Engage the Nations, a nonprofit where he and a team of amazing people have built a school in Malawi, Africa, providing opportunities for the poorest of the poor to have life-changing education. So in this episode today, we talk about his journey and when he first began to see things, hear things, and know things as a kid, how he developed his gifts and found his first mentor. And Matt shares many of his stories of healing people from his travel around the world, because I wanted to make sure that you guys heard some of those stories, and then how he has helped other people realize their gifts and abilities to remove pain, demons, entities from people. And then we talk a little bit too about a variety of things like speaking in tongue in the church versus what's called light language in the metaphysical world. So I can't wait for you all to listen to this episode. Please take some clips of it, share it with a friend. If you share it on social media, tag me, tag Matt. I'm really excited to hear what you guys think about this episode and what you learned from it. So please reach out and share. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of I Love It When. I'm really excited today to introduce you to a new friend of mine, Matt Young. Matt, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'm excited for everybody to learn more about you.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be with you.
Can you start off by just telling us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so for the last 4 months, I've been in kind of the metaphysical world, um, just doing like what you would call intuitive readings and like physical hands-on healing. And for probably 30 years, I was in the church world and started at some point, maybe 10 years ago, started seeing like dramatic healings, broken bones, like deaf people being able to hear, blind people, back pain, just wild, wild stuff. And I've had experiences my whole life. Um, and then a lot of times, because it's just kind of been a natural thing, I was trying to figure out how do I teach other people how to do this?
Hmm.
Um, because that's kind of been my thing working with youth and adults, trying to figure out like how do you recreate these experiences so it's not just happening to me, so that other people can kind of step into it. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of titles, but I've been called a lot of things. That's always the tricky thing, is if you don't tell somebody this is what I am, or people sometimes they just don't understand, different language,
Hmm.
different communities.
Hmm. Absolutely. How did you share? Can you share your journey with us, starting from the beginning of how did you begin to discover these different gifts that you had, and how did you learn to work with it?
Yeah, so it's kind of fun, or scary. When I was a little kid, probably 6, 7 years old, I started having these light beings coming into my room, and as you can just imagine, it's like, and I'm seeing it with my eyes open. They're all over the room. Like even as I talk about them, I can see what they look like. But as a kid, it was so terrifying. I would actually scream out to my dad, where normally it would just be like, my mom if I was having a bad dream or something. And this went on for like weeks, and if I was to like, I couldn't tell you if I was born this way or if that's the event where it happened. I'm pretty sure it was I had these abilities before. But that was like the most significant thing that I can remember of like seeing with my
Hmm.
eyes open. And then from there, if you just like fast forward through all the years, in the church world they call it knowing, Jesus knew men's thoughts is what it says in the Bible. And then in the metaphysical world they call it the claircognizant. It's like, because you know, because I would
Hmm.
just know stuff about people. And unfortunately, I thought I was really smart because I would just know good and bad things about people. And because I was a bit rough, I would actually just like, if I got a little bit bugged or bothered by someone, I would just like call them out on stuff and then see the look on their face. And they were just like, like, and it was good and bad stuff. They'd be like, how did you know that? And sometimes I would like see stuff. So it's like, I wrote a book called The Seer. I wrote it like 2 years ago to help the church with like biblically based, what does it mean to see in the spirit realm? And then, in the metaphysical world, they just call it clairvoyance.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I've been seeing, and I would say probably the thing that's happened the least is hearing, like in my mind. But it's like feeling, knowing, seeing. Those are the most common ways that I would pick up information. And then I should probably also mention I didn't grow up with religion. I didn't grow up with
Hmm.
spirituality. I didn't grow up with any of that stuff. And so it wasn't until like in my 20s I ended up in a church. So that's kind of the rough background of like how I, started to know stuff. And it was like just through the years of just, I think like everybody else, practice and discernment and figuring out like what is this, because honestly I thought everybody could see things. And
Hmm.
so I didn't tell anybody. I thought everybody knew stuff. And so once I started telling people, then that's when you get this guy's crazy, or and then the people that would be like, "Oh, he's crazy." Then those would be the ones I'd be like, "Oh, really? Is that why you're doing this and this and this in your life?" And they would be like, and I'd be like, "There you go."
Uh, so I knew this was going to happen too. Like as you shared stuff, I have questions that came up because I think about myself when I was little, and I'm sure I had some experiences that I either blocked out or forgot about. So when you first started seeing these light beings in your room, you saw them like with your own eyes, not with your eyes closed in your mind's eye, but with your eyes. How did you begin to interact with them, or just did they just come and go and it just was something that just happened?
Yeah, it was more of I was just terrified, and
Hmm.
they just kept coming back, and I'm pretty sure stuff got activated by them being in the room. And you could call them angels or beings
Hmm.
or like that's where names are always an interesting thing.
Hmm.
Um, but it's actually kind of funny because like my childhood bedroom, like there was many like spiritual experiences I had in that room. So sometimes I joke like I'm gonna go to my parents' house to go spend the night in that room because there's something amazing about that room.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. So did you get a mentor when you got to the church? Like, did that help kind of set up some sort of a structure or framework for you?
So it's super funny, positive, negative story, right? So when I joined the church, I was like I had lots of growth to do. And because I was good at sports, I was always put in leadership positions, but I was like the person that should have never been leading anything because it was like, just chaotic and but I always had natural leadership abilities. So like within like the first year of being in the church, like I was part of a college ministry. I'm put on leadership. And I was even thinking to myself, like, I've no business being in a leadership anything in a church or literally anywhere except for in sports. Like I played rugby and football. So it made sense to be aggressive and that kind of stuff. Um, but I remember I actually started praying for a mentor because I knew there were some areas of my life that I needed to grow in. And no joke, 7 years I prayed and I came across this really like I didn't know what a narcissist was back then, but I came across this like almost sinister narcissistic leader in the church who in some ways he did help me. But in other ways it was just like destructive, like the kind of guy that was preaching a sermon and it was aimed at me instead of him just talking to me, because he just didn't feel like he had the power to do anything. He'd actually preach things against me, and my friends would be like, "Hey, Matt, did you know that was about?" And I like, from the claircognizant standpoint, I was like, "Oh yeah, this is not God speaking to me or convicting me. This is literally this guy." So he's pretty sinister, and it was. I
Hmm.
always like to tell this story. Like this is where you trust your gut. I was helping him move a family member and by the way, praying for 7 years for a mentor, finding no one. And we're driving, and he's like, Matt, I feel like the Lord's telling me that, it's time for me to mentor you. And he was mentoring almost every college age man in the group. And before he could finish his sentence, it just came out of me, nope. and and he was shocked. And I was like, kind of like, where did that come from? But I was like, oh no, no thanks. We're good. Um, and it was like shortly after that, probably 6 months to a year, I went to another church, and no joke, like I'm there for not even like a couple weeks, and this man walks by, and again, I've been praying for 7 years, and this is like the 7 year point. I was like, he's like, hey, my name's Pete. He's like, I do this and this, and I heard him say mentor people, and I grabbed his hand, and I go, what are you doing for lunch today? And he looks at me and he goes, well, I'm free. And so we went to lunch. And then for the next 5 years, he just poured into me and really helped me from like, I have a mom and dad, great people, but he really helped me develop spiritually. He helped me develop as a teacher, so many different ways that, like, probably 5 years. And I remember one of the best things he did is like 2 weeks in, he says, hey, so you need to consider who will be your mentor after me. And in my mind, I thought, you will never leave me. You'll be my mentor forever. Like that's how desperate I was for help because I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to explain it. I would go to their house, to his and his wife's house, and I would be like, this presence, this energy, this like I was like, woo, like I was like, what is this love? What is this in your house? It was so amazing because he didn't really feel stuff, but I did. But I was like, whatever you got, dude, I need more of it. And so, long story short, when he ended up moving to Chicago, it was like, it's bittersweet, but it was like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready for the next person. But it was like, yeah, that 7-year prayer finally got answered. And part of me thinks I probably wasn't ready for what he could offer. But when I was, it was like it's like when the student is ready, the teacher appears kind of fun stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Wow, 7 years is a long time to wait and be patient for that. How interesting. Did he, so and he had different giftings from you, but he was just able to kind of walk you through how he grew in those and okay.
Well, and what's so funny is he would have considered himself not a very spiritual person, but he was the guy that'd be like, he'd be like, so Margaret, and he would tell a story, and I'd be sitting there going like, he's literally telling the story of my life, and he didn't even know it.
Okay.
And again,
Wow.
it's the Jesus knew men's thoughts, or that's the
Hmm.
claircognizant ability. He didn't even know he had it, and it was
Hmm.
just like I would be like going like, okay, I need to share this with him because he literally is talking about me and doesn't even know it. So, and
Wow.
I didn't understand it then. Like now in hindsight, like I definitely understood,
Hmm.
um, what was going on. And he just all he did just loved me. That was the thing I needed. That was so like essential.
That's so fascinating too that you felt that energy at his house and that he wasn't really aware of it, but that it was there. Interesting. So how did you get to this point then of traveling around the world and doing this work? How did that evolve?
Yeah, I mean, I always like to tell people my goal in life was to be a high school science teacher. That was like my thing. I worked at the science center. I did like all kinds of different stuff. Like that's what I want. And I thought like, oh, I'll coach high school football and high school rugby. And I did that too. But so yeah, I mean, I just helped out in the church, and then because of having leadership abilities, I just kept being put into different, like a lot of times just volunteer positions, started working with kids, and the the groups would grow pretty quickly, and lives were being changed, and a lot of it stems from that mentoring from his name was Pete.
Mm,
That's really like just him walking with me through all that. um, I had never well, let me back up. During that 7-year period of nothing, I was in church, kind of sitting in the back, which I love to do because I could see spiritually different things going on. I still remember this guest preacher. He's like singing and then he's preaching, and he was just a very gifted man. And then the main pastor comes on stage, and I hear this voice, and again, I don't hear, and it wasn't an external, it was internal, I think. It's hard to remember, but
mhm,
I hear this voice say, "You're going to do the same thing as that guy, and you're going to do it full time." And this is how ignorant I was. I thought you get saved, you go to church, and then you work your way up like in a business. Because
mhm.
again, leadership giftings, that's what I'm thinking is like you just work your way up like any business.
Yeah.
I never understood people who would do like an entry level position and then had no desire to like move up. So when I first told somebody, because they said, "What is your calling?" And I was like, and I just said, "Well, doesn't everybody, isn't their goal to become a pastor?" And then the guy started laughing at me. And then he goes, "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't laugh because I didn't know. Like, I didn't grow up with religion or anything."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, "Well, this voice, like, I thought this was just normal I was like, well, this voice told me I was going to," and I said it was God, but I was like, "This voice told me I was going to do this, this, and this." And he goes, "Matt, that's not what everybody experiences." I was like, "What?" So it's kind of like unveiling, like,
Hmm.
I have a kind of a different path. And so for me, I just like was led by like what I would call the spirit, and just kept doing stuff that didn't always make sense. So
Hmm.
many wild stories where I'd end up somewhere that, like, how did I get here? It wasn't until to answer your question, like how did I start traveling? It was I did an internship, and I loved, I did an internship at a Presbyterian church, and we took a trip to the Dominican Republic, which was wild in itself. I fell off a roof and all this other kind of stuff. But it was probably 10 years ago where um, I started seeing physical healings. Now, this is the crazy thing is you think of a church or a pastor of like, them praying for you. And sure, I'd pray for people, but I'd never
Mm,
put my hands on somebody. And even though I'd read through the Bible, I saw that Jesus healed people and there was other people that healed through the Old and New Testament. I didn't realize, I mean, I'd heard stories, but I didn't realize it was actually more common.
mm,
And so it's like, I don't know what you would call it, cognitive dissonance or whatever. I just didn't know because I never saw it in church. And I really hardly ever saw, even though you'd read it in the Bible, never saw people praying. And so 10 years ago, I'm a youth pastor in a charismatic church, which if people don't know what that even means, they're open to more spiritual things, speaking in
mm,
tongues, light language, like all that kind of stuff. And this girl had a broken hand, and like the short version is I prayed for her and it got healed, and I didn't even believe it. I was like thinking she was just lying to get attention.
mm,
Until I called her mom and was like, "So Chloe says her hand was broken," because it didn't make sense because she didn't have a cast on when I prayed for her. Um, and her mom's like, yeah, she was playing third base and put up her hand. Uh, or sorry, she didn't get her mid up in time and stuck her hand in front of her face and broke her hand. And then when we went to the doctor, they said, come back in 24 hours when the swelling's gone down and then we'll put a cast on it. Well, there was other plans. She ended up getting completely healed. And it was so shocking because I should like I'm already telling you the story, but like I went to like again, I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no training, no nothing. I may have saw something on TV once
mm,
about somebody praying for healing or whatever, but I put my hand on her hand. I just said, I command, your hand to be healed. And she's like, almost all the pain's gone. And I was like, I got so excited. I grabbed her hand so hard. I was like, I command your hand to be healed.
mm.
I was so excited. Well, if I would have known her hand was broken, I would have never done that. Like I would have been too scared. And she jumped on me. 12-year-old girl jumps on me, is hugging me. She's so excited. And I'm looking, there's like 50 kids in the room, a bunch of adults. And I'm just thinking, this is really inappropriate, this 12-year-old girl hugging me like this. And and I still honestly I didn't believe her. Like I was skeptical of all this stuff. Like I mean, I've seen stuff, I've experienced stuff, but I was like, you had a broken hand and it's healed? Like how does that even? And then
Yeah.
even when I talked to the mom, I was like, oh, like maybe this is real. And so, yeah, I mean, so it was really that was kind of the starting point. And then that summer we went to Malawi, Africa, and just lots of lots of different healings, casting demons out of people, just wild, fun stuff. Some of it I learned, most of it I learned just kind of on the way. And then after I'd
Mm,
have an experience, I'd ask other people who had experienced these kind of things, like, well, what do you do in this situation, or how do you do this, and just kind of getting feedback. But most of it, just kind of figured it out along the way. So pretty wild. That was kind of the beginning of how all that kind of took place.
wow. I love hearing that part of the story because I think, um, well, it just reminds me of a lot of different stories for myself than I've shared on the podcast about my journey with religion and faith and kind of how it's unfolded. And also just this idea that I think I always felt like there was supposed to be a structure or a way that we're supposed to learn. And just how you let it unfold naturally and how you get led to do one thing and then the next really says a lot about how just following your heart or following your intuition, or whatever you want to call it, is really all you need to do. Would you talk a little bit more or share another couple more stories about some of your experiences with the healings? Like, I think your episode's going to air after I've just interviewed Kai Bertrand, where I asked her a whole bunch of questions too. Because as a lot of the listeners know, I've shared that I've had a fear of being possessed by a demon, and I think a lot of this has been fears that were put on me by TV shows, movies, people around me, like just all these different things that we get told. And like Kai shared in her episode, in Hawaii, it's much more accepted to talk about all of this. It's much more like, oh yeah, this is just. Whereas in America, you say that and people, I mean, I would freak out. People would freak out about the idea of it. And so I think kind of normalizing what it is, uh, and how you've worked with it before in the past would be awesome.
Yeah, so that's kind of a huge thing. Like, so
It is.
some funny things that come to mind that just resonates from what you just said of like Americans don't believe this stuff. Like, so I was a pastor in a Southern Baptist church. Now, if you don't know what that means, it's like the very conservative kind of I don't want to say crazy, but just controlled, don't really believe that anything supernatural happens anymore. And that's the thing about religion is there's 75 flavors of ice cream and none of them believe anything that's it's like not even really the same thing. They don't
Hmm.
like the practice of how they do stuff. So I've been in like all these different flavors of ice cream because I always was like, I don't, where do I fit in these groups? Like I never could find like, oh, this is the place or this is the place.
Hmm.
So what's been funny is I have this friend who would like call me after I would go on a trip and he'd be like, "Hey, let me buy you lunch. I want to hear your stories." And he'd always be like, "Tell me the stories that happen in Europe or tell me the stories that happen in Africa." And so what I would always do is I'd tell him what happened in America, like, oh, there's this lady on the floor, 135 pounds, and this voice is like, "You will not cast me out," and I'm laughing, and I'm telling him these stories, and he's thinking it's like, oh, this happens in Africa because they're open to the spiritual world, and this is a normal part of their life. And then after I would tell him all these stories, I'd be like, oh, by the way, I haven't even gotten to the Africa stories, and he's like, what? Uh, and like this has just been my life is like I always like to tell people I was like walking through Walmart, minding my own business, and this kid manifested a demon and he literally spit on me. And like if that was an adult, it would have been like, all right, bro. But it was like a kid. And the dad was African and he looks at me and he knew like this was not his kid, this was a spirit. And I just looked at him and I was like, don't worry, like I know what it is. You know what it is. And he's like, I'm so sorry, I'll take care of it.
Wow.
But it's like that's like not the normal everyday experience.
No.
So I guess like the simple thing is when somebody has some physical issue, like there's obviously genetic, there's obviously like things that run in family, all that kind of stuff, or things that happens from lack of diet and exercise and all that stuff. But if it's a spirit, just putting your hands on somebody, commanding it to go, if you have any kind of energy, power, spirit, whatever you want to call it, it'll pretty much go right away. And that's what I learned like over the years. And the first time, I always like to do it by my kids' ages. You know, my daughter was 7 and she was with me, so this is like all normal to my kids. So 7 years old, I brought a youth group to Malawi. Um, all the kids are praying for somebody, and then the kind of the leader of this organization that we were visiting says, "Hey, will you pray for this man?" So I'm like, "Oh, here's a albino guy who obviously looks like something is going on." The interpreter was not there for some reason, and I learned very quickly if somebody had a spirit and I put my hand on them, that they started to experience tremendous pain just like that because that
Hmm.
spirit would attack them.
Hmm.
And what was really funny is this as this is going on, I had heard that the woman who runs the whole that section of the facility wasn't there, but that she was coming. And when they see like a bunch of Americans, they just kind of assume we don't really know what we're doing because just what you said before is people don't realize this stuff happens in the Western world. So this was probably the first demon I cast out of somebody. And so it was really funny because he's having all these physical pains. Like you could call it a healing too, but he's having all these physical issues. I put my hand on him and he was like, freaking out. And I didn't know what to do because I have no like I don't know what I'm doing. And all I do is I start waving my hand. I was like, Shakarasi, and I start praying in the church calls it tongues, metaphysical world calls it light language. And as I start doing this, he just and I good thing I was somewhat athletic, right? He just goes, and unfortunately some people throw this is why this stuff freaks people out is
Yeah.
sometimes people throw up this is also funny sometimes people burp and sometimes people fart when they're getting delivered, which is just like it sounds wild if you've never heard it, but then when you
Hmm.
see it over and over again. So long story short, dude throws up. I kind of moved to the side, and the woman who ran the facility had walked in the middle, very like 6'2", very powerful woman sitting in the back like this. Doesn't say hi to me. And as soon as the dude throws up, she's like, "Yeah." And I just looked and I was like, because I knew she was kind of like, what is this guy doing? Who is he? Like, is he really gonna do anything?
Yeah.
And she's like, it's about time he got delivered to that demon. And I was like, oh, so you knew. So it's kind of like accidental deliverance because
Hmm.
like now I know what I'm doing, but back then I had no idea. And in on that trip, it was just one person after the other that we were praying for, and they would have, different physical issues. We got to go to a basically a group of women who had been either abandoned by their husband or had experienced some kind of probably, mostly physical sexual abuse. And so it was myself and another leader and then a bunch of the kids like praying for people and just seeing like all kinds of stuff. And it's probably worth noting that like the story I told, girl with a broken hand, that was probably like January, and then this is the summer. And so within that period of time, I had started teaching the kids how to do this stuff. And so the kids were actually starting to see like people getting healed and, different ankle sprains and just different things that kids would have, that would happen to kids. They would start seeing this kind of stuff that like this was just normal to everyone. And here's my 7-year-old daughter praying for some like 70-year-old woman, and again, as a little kid, they don't really consider, oh, this might not work. They don't consider
Hmm.
like, oh, sometimes people don't get healed. And so like I'm praying for someone, I'm looking over and my daughter's got her hands on someone and the pain's leaving this like 70-year-old woman. So that was kind of the even the shift in that group is it went from me doing everything to then the kids doing everything. And then when we started traveling, sometimes people would get upset because I would go teach or preach, and then it would be like time for people to come forward for a word or what the church calls a word, what the metaphysical calls an intuitive reading. And I would actually step back, and then the kids would come forward, and then some of the adults would be like, "Well, why aren't you doing it?" It's like, "Because I don't need to. They can do the same thing as me." Um, and then that was kind of like just the overall thing. So I'll tell you a fun story that it's like I've seen lots of different healings, but the other thing that's happened, um, feathers manifesting, gold, and the best way to explain it is like if you looked at your hand and you see like what looks like gold flakes where you go like this, like
Hmm.
sometimes women have it for makeup. Like I've known people that they were just covered with it, and for me it's a sign the miracle realm is open. And like I'm in France doing a Protestant Catholic meeting, and in the middle of praying for people, people are screaming, demons, people are getting healed, people are falling over, shaking, like all this kind of fun stuff. And this woman that I mentored for like 3 years, Marie, I was like, hey, she's French and we're in France. I was like, Marie, you see all the gold around the room? Well, she had never seen it before. I'd seen it a bunch of times. And she thought it was like kids playing.
Hmm.
And I'd like, look, Marie, it's around the whole, on the floor, all the way around the room. And then I hear her dad in French go, Marie, Marie. And I don't know French enough to know, but I knew he was saying to her, do you see all the gold? And she was like, it was like that was the moment her mind kind of opened up to go, oh, like she had seen cool stuff happen, but she'd never seen that kind of thing happen. And then probably 10 minutes later, just disappeared. And so this wasn't like, oh,
Wow.
I see it in the spirit. It literally manifested.
Hmm.
So just kind of wild. And for me, those are what you call a sign that makes you wonder, or a sign to me that points to something else. And that's where you always have to go, okay, what is this sign pointing towards? Like manifestations are fun, they're exciting, but then and it makes for a cool story, right? But then it's like, well, what
Hmm.
is it actually pointing to? That's always the question. And in that situation, there was lots of people getting delivered from demons and then different people getting like physically healed, which was just fun. And the first person that came forward, this is also the other thing that's hilarious. We're in France in a small city that most people don't speak English. A lot of French actually do speak English, but in this city, it wasn't very common. And so the first person, like, I put my hands on her, and as soon as I put my hands on her, she's probably same height as me, like just nice church lady. She's in English going, Mary, Mary, Mary. and
Oh my
and
gosh.
then I like to call it the timber. She just starts going, and in the church we always have catchers because sometimes power comes and people like manifest in different ways. And she's falling over, and I had been mentoring Marie for quite a while, but she had never seen that kind of thing happen. And she just looks at me. She's like, "What do we do?" And And she didn't even realize, she didn't think about the fact that that woman's French and that demon is speaking English.
Mhm.
And I said, because there was other people helping us. I go, don't worry, they'll take. And I go, just I grabbed her hand. I was like, step over her, and we just stepped over and then started praying for other people, um, because it was, she was like, what, like she was freaking out, like demon possessed person. Like I knew this was real, but like, and I was like, don't worry, it's okay, you know. And that's happened multiple times in different settings where, um, as I've gotten more comfortable, and sometimes I'm not as in tuned or paying attention. Like this happened in Malawi, Africa once too, where I'm waiting for the interpreter to say, hey, how can Matt pray for you? And I put my hand on this woman's shoulder. The moment I touch her, she full on, and this is like probably 5'5", very strong African woman, just swings at me. And my daughter, it's again, my daughter's 10 at the time with me. And I just was like, and just barely, if she would have connected, I probably would have went, but it was a demon manifesting her just from me touching her. And I'd like, the church leaders pulled her aside and took her, outside to pray for her. And I just look at my daughter, I was like, you good? And she's like, yep. And and so her and I just prayed for everybody.
Wow, that's amazing.
Just wild.
So you've talked about teaching this to kids. How do you find it is teaching it to adults?
So it's a little bit of it's like if you just thought of your 10 best friends, male and female, and just said like each of them have their own belief systems, how they think things work.
Hmm.
So it's like there's some general things to teach people, but then a lot of times it's just getting them out of the way of whatever they believe. Because
Hmm.
like I like to joke, and I've said this to you before, is like if you believe in the Ooga Booga fairy and it works for you,
Hmm.
well, God bless you. Like,
Hmm.
but if it doesn't work for you, maybe try something different that works. And I'm
Hmm.
not saying everybody needs to do what I'm doing. I don't think that at all. But I think everybody has the potential to do this kind of stuff a bit. It's like the like I'm not going to go start building houses and doing construction. That's not my thing. But
Hmm.
this is my thing. And so it's more important to figure out what is your thing. But like
Hmm.
when it comes to adults, it's also the same thing of like the experiential aspect of like finding ways to practice doing this kind of work. That's where kind of the rubber meets the road, because and that's what I love to do is a lot of times when I do a trip to another country, especially Africa, is like I've taken so many teams with me. And kind of the church world, it's like, I'm the pastor, I do everything. Well, I'm like the opposite. I'm like, I don't want to do
Hmm.
anything. I'm gonna like, it's like, all right, Mo, you're preaching tonight, you're gonna pray for everybody after the service, and I'm gonna watch.
Hmm.
Like that's my style, is like trial by fire, put people in, because that's how they experience. But the difference between adults and kids are just like, okay,
Yeah.
where adults are like, oh, I even this weekend I did an expo and did a healing event. A bunch of people got healed, and I had this friend of mine who's very, very intuitive, and I've been kind of working with her. I was like, all right, so you've looked at pictures, you've given people readings in person. I was like, now I'm gonna have you do it publicly in one of my meetings. And she was like shaking. And then it was super awesome because this is the thing, is like it's the experience. She has no idea whether what she's saying is right or not, and
Hmm.
she's literally like standing there in front of this woman saying a bunch of stuff, and the woman's like kind of shocked, right? And then it was really funny because she goes, and I'm sensing, she goes, do you have I don't remember what the diagnosis was. And the woman's like, no, I don't. And like, so she's standing here and talking to this person. Well, it's the person behind her who had the actual diagnosis.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, see, and this, I would say this woman's a little bit more advanced than the average bear, but
Hmm.
it's like everybody can do this stuff, to a certain level. So yeah, with adults, sometimes there's a little more encouragement, getting people to believe in themselves, and just some of it is like people intellectually want to know how this stuff works,
Hmm.
and that's the part where like, yeah, practice makes perfect. And I always say like, if you pray for somebody and nothing happens, well, it's impossible for nothing to happen. But
Mm-hmm.
it looks that way. And for me, I believe 100% of the time, 100% of the people I pray for are going to get healed. And when they don't, I just move on to the next person. I'm not like, I don't like, I'm an outcome based practical person,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm also not going to spend all my time going, oh my gosh, why didn't that person get healed? And I'm going to focus on the people that do get healed. And then sometimes they don't get healed and you come back, pray again. Like I've seen that happen. I'll just tell you that story. I'm in Uganda, and I prayed like for probably 7 days straight, 3 meetings a day, hundreds of people at every situation. And by the end, I'm tired, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they roll this girl in, and this is what I was like. I'm always frustrated with the pastors in Africa. I'm like, don't bring me the worst person last. Bring them first when I'm like, woo, you know? So I'm tired. I've prayed for everyone, and all I see is this girl getting rolled up in this wheelchair. Now, this is like outside village church, sticks holding up tin roof kind of church. And they roll her up, boom, 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 boom. And again, it's this very large African mom standing behind her, and they say, what's wrong with her? Well, she can't see, she can't hear, and she can't walk. And I was like, oh, I'm so tired. Um, so I start praying in tongues, light language, and I'm like, Shakarasita, and I'm like putting my hands for 5 minutes, nothing happens. And I'm asking, all right, spirit, like, should I keep praying? Should I just stop? What do I do? And I see in my mind this image of someone going like snapping their fingers. And I just thought that is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my entire life. I am not snapping my fingers at some little girl in a wheelchair. I probably saw it on TV somewhere with someone do
Yeah.
something like that. And then I prayed probably another 5 minutes. Nothing happens. And I'm just like, ugh. Like my heart is like, I want to see this girl run around, like jump up and down, see, hear everything. And I finally like give up. I was like, all right, maybe this was the spirit who showed me this. So I just go up to her and I go, like I totally give it up. And she just goes, and then the mom's like, Rebecca, Rebecca. And the girl starts turning her head. And I'm thinking, because again, I still have a little bit of that little bit of that skeptic in me. And I'm like, did she just somehow sense the motion even though she couldn't see? And literally that's she was able to hear just from me, like when I snapped my fingers she could hear. And
Wow.
the mom, this taught me a valuable lesson. I'm disappointed she can't walk and she can't see, but now she can hear, and I'm just like tired, upset. I'm like, why didn't more happen? The mom is jumping up and down, my
Mm-hmm.
daughter can hear, she's so excited. And I'm just like, so it taught me a valuable lesson of like, let the results be what they are. Do
Mm-hmm.
what your part is. Um, but I'm so glad that I snapped my fingers, even though I felt really dumb doing it. Because it's like that's how sometimes these things work. Is sometimes you see it, sometimes you know it, sometimes you feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, just wild stuff. But in that case, she didn't have a demon, she didn't have a spirit attached to her. This is just you know kind of the conditions of the village, and her birth was rough and all this other kind of medical issues. When I asked them later, that was like why she had this kind of experience. So, yeah, pretty fun.
Wow. Hey, I'm popping in for a moment to let you know that if you're interested in working with me one on one in a small group, or you'd like to attend one of my upcoming retreats, please reach out or add yourself to my email list. You can go to iloveitwhen.org and scroll to the bottom where you'll see there's a spot to sign up. I also love to speak, teach, and create experiences for small, medium, or large size companies. If you know someone that I should know, please connect us. I'm looking to utilize I Love It When to create global change, and that will require collaborating with all of you. You're all so much more powerful than you realize. Remind yourself of that today. Have you had like a vision or an image in your mind of where all this is taking you? Or do you just go kind of like day by day, week by week?
Yeah, I'm pretty simple and practical. Like I it's always I talk out of both sides of my mouth often. on one hand, I'm like, all right, so here's what the next 5 years holds. This is my plan, like leadership stuff. Like, I'll be doing this and this. And I would literally, well, I should probably back up. There's a story I should tell you. So
Hmm.
there's that aspect, but then there's also like even right now, I'm 4 months into the metaphysical world. I think I see where it's going, but there's a lot of moving parts.
Hmm.
And it's also just like, okay, so um when results happen, sometimes people see amazing results and they don't care. They're just like, yeah, whatever. So it's just a matter of connecting to the right people and the right places and the right thing. But what would probably be helpful is, again, this is kind of a fun story. So that church that I was at, year one, it's before I went on that Malawi mission trip. um they had a private, like, supernatural school where they invited these mystics in, who in the church world they might call them a mystic or a prophet or a prophetess. In the metaphysical world, they call them a psychic or intuitive or
Hmm.
oracle. Or and oracle is a word that's in the Bible. It's interchangeable. um and that's the fun thing, like terms, like people don't even half the time even know what any of that stuff means. We'll just say they invited in some three people that were very powerful, like, people. And I'm come from the intellectual Christianity, and even though I'd had all these experiences, I never connected that I could pray and someone could get healed and all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff, even though it started happening. So I'm in the back of the room and having this vision of this girl trying to kill herself in my youth group, which eventually
Hmm.
I found out she did, and we called the police and saved her life and all that kind of stuff. But literally from a vision, I was like, oh my God, something's happening to this girl. Talk to the parents. That happened in the meeting. And as soon as I opened my eyes, one of the leaders of the church, because they always knew I like to sit in the back because spiritually I could see way better. She's like up in the front going like this to me. And I'm like, I don't want to go up the front because I'm thinking these people are crazy. They're screaming, they're shouting. There's people, like, what's called being drunk in the Holy Spirit, where there's so much energy flowing through them. They're laughing and falling over. It's like the wildest party. And I'm just going like, I'm looking like, all right, who's got demons? And I'm looking at them going like, most of these people are pretty clean. What is this all about? Because it's kind of new to me, right? And I come forward because I'm a pastor at the church, and this is one of the elders telling me to come forward. And so I'm like, well, I better listen. And I'm like, all I can see is this guy, like, just really strong guy going, and he's like hitting people on the chest for some reason. And I'm like, what are these? Like, this is wild. And because I grew up kind of getting in some trouble, and all I can think of is, if this dude hits me in the chest, I'm gonna knock him out. Like, it's like self-protection, right? Because I'm like, this is weirdo town. What are these people doing, right? Well, I joined Weirdo Town pretty quick. So they're doing the worship service, right? Which was probably 30 minutes. And the main speaker is drunk in the Holy Spirit. So he's falling over on me, and he's giving me a reading or a prophecy in the church, and he's saying all these things, and he's like, "What?" He's laughing, and I'm just thinking, like, how does he know all this stuff, and how is he saying this stuff about my life, right? Even though I've done this my whole life, I'd never done it in kind of a more professional sense. So I get into the middle of the room, all this just wild stuff. And all I did is I stuck my hand straight up in the air and just tried to focus on the music. And this was hilarious. I leave my body and I start flying over the world. Okay, now this is the funny thing, is sometimes people talk about these stories like, oh, in my imagination I saw this. No, literally, I felt myself fly out of my body. I'm flying over the world, and I started flying over Africa first, and then I went to Europe, and then, I won't tell you all the rest because it's personal, but I started going to all these places. And by the way, worship ends, there's no more music. The MC comes up and he's wanting to introduce the guest speaker, and everyone sat down. I'm frozen in the middle of the room like this, having this encounter. And I come back into my body. And it's that thing where, like, oh, there's no music. What's going on? How long was I gone? I was probably gone for probably 30 minutes. And that speaker that's like, "Wah," falling over, while this was happening, he understood, he knew I had left my body. So he went and grabbed these tissues from like a Kleenex box because he's just having fun. Like he starts sticking them all the way through my shirt. So I've got Kleenex all. So when I come back into my body, like I had a collared shirt on, and I'm like what? And then I look at him and he's got this look of like, ha, I did that. And he's like laughing. And I was like, what in the world? But to go back to how did you know you're going to be traveling the world? How did you know? Because in that encounter, I literally went first to Uganda. I went to all these places in Africa and then Europe. And then I won't share kind of the other stuff, but it was like what had happened in that encounter is all the things that like where I'm at right now was what I saw in that experience. And
Mm,
so that's where you could say, okay, here's my 25-step business plan. Um, that's what happened in that experience. And so that's how I've always kind of lived my life is I do
mhm,
both. It's like the
mhm,
woo woo spiritual stuff, but when those events happen, you just go with it. Like I built a
mhm,
school in Africa because I had three African chiefs come into my room in the spirit realm. Like I would have never ever done anything like that if I didn't have that experience. But when you have those kind of experiences, you're like, all right, I'm listening, you know? So that's in a roundabout way that answers your question of like, yeah, do you have a plan? Did you yeah, I mean, but I don't tell anybody what I just told you because I don't usually tell people. But the fun thing about that out of body experience is I'd had other experiences as a kid and different things that I'd never told anybody. And the beauty about that group of people is they knew what was happening,
mhm,
and most of them are a little older than I was at the time, and they just let it happen. Nobody tried to like come up and bump me or do anything. They just let it happen because they were like
mhm,
they all they had gotten a prophetic word about a certain guy coming and doing certain things in the church like 15 years ago, and they believed it was me. And so they just kind of left me alone to grow and experience what I needed to experience. And those are one of the things that I'm so thankful that they just let it happen. They let me
mhm,
be who I am. And they understood what was happening to me because most of them had been in these kind of realms for years, more than even I did at the time. To me at the time, it was just like, well, wow, that was an exciting experience. And I have this guy giving me this intuitive reading, like, how does he know this information about me? You know,
yeah,
just wild.
that is so wild. I loved when I came to one of your classes at one of the MeWe fairs where you talked about light language and how to activate that for yourself, because you talk a lot about speaking in tongue or light language when you're praying for people and doing these healings. Can you talk a little bit more about how that came to you? Because I found that super interesting. As someone, well, I'm constantly taking in information. And I think, especially when it comes to my gifts and like leaning into growing more, I don't feel like I have things just happen to me like what you describe. So
Right.
I think a lot of that has to do with what we're able to take in and what our human self is able to comprehend or allow. But yeah, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that aspect for people.
Yeah, I think and when it comes to the metaphysical light language, I know about this much, but I'm learning. But
Hmm.
this is what happened. So I'm back in my parents' house in that room, right? And I was early 20s and I was attending that church. Remember the 7 years I prayed for a mentor, and some like in that church they believed in speaking in tongues. I had no idea what that meant. I honestly thought they were kind of wacko. And some guy prayed for me to speak in tongues, and I was just like, I didn't even know what that meant. And I had not even really read the Bible at that point, didn't understand any of it. But I'm a risk taker, like to have fun, like to experience stuff. So, like, he just told me, okay, so before you go to bed or when you wake up, um, he said, ask for the Spirit to baptize you in fire, because in the Bible it talks about the baptism of the Holy Spirit is fire, which I always think is funny now because there's so many Christians that are like praying for people and they're like fire, 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 and they don't even realize what they're praying. But that's a whole nother thing. So I'm in bed every night, probably a month, every night before I go to bed. I'm like, Spirit, I just ask you baptize me with your fire or something like that. I don't. It's so long ago. I was maybe 23, and no joke, it was this like bam, power hit me, and uncontrollably I'm like "Shakara satara para," and just like, and in my mind, because I've told you I'm a skeptic. In my mind, I'm like, what in the world is happening? And for most people, it's not like this. Most
Mhm.
people, it's kind of an uneventful, not feeling much of anything when this happens to them. And but that's literally what happened. That same room, it was like power hit me, kind of my body like woo, and then yeah, and then I started speaking in tongues. But again, I had no idea what that was. I hadn't
Mhm.
even read that in the Bible yet. It wasn't until years later that I ended up in another church that didn't believe in that.
Mhm.
And so I didn't even know that Christians had all these different crazy belief systems. And so I started speaking in tongues in one of those places that, oh, you can't do that. And I'm like, oh. And I'm always the person when somebody says, oh, you can't do that. I'm like, oh, really? Like kind of pushing. I've matured a little bit. I try not to push buttons too much. But what was interesting is just like I think everybody has different experiences and they start to maybe doubt it a bit. I had
Mhm.
started to doubt whether that was even real, even though by that time, years later, I was different church, different environment. Um, and had stopped doing it because even though I'd read it in the Bible, I didn't really get what the point was. Um, and I was doing life coaching and doing these classes, working with the court system, and doing these 32-week classes on neurochemistry of the brain to like abuse and DV and all this kind of stuff. And I had this guy in there that was like, "Hey, does anybody know how to speak in tongues or how that happens?" Well, I at that point was kind of doubting it because I was like, I don't even know if it's real. But I had a pastor in that class of like a bunch of people, and I knew it, but I told him, don't tell anybody because they're going to be asking you to pray for them and all this other stuff because there's a bunch of Christians. But that night, when that guy asked that question at the end of class, I just looked over at him and I go, hey, you want to do your thing? And he's like, sure. And so he just led them through a prayer. And literally, again, kind of the similar experience that I had in my room. I'm hearing it in my head and I'm feeling this power. And then here's this like older man bawling, and this voice is coming out of him that sounds like a Native American. Is like that's the best way I could explain it. And you can just see like he had demons, he had stuff attached to him, and you could just see it all. He was just getting cleared out, and everything was starting to leave him. And I was like, I'll never forget that. So fast forward to that church where I saw the broken hands healing or healed and all that kind of other kind of stuff. I just started stepping out with the kids, and it's like, all right, guys, this is where the power comes from. So I would pray for kids to be like we called it being filled with the Holy Spirit. It's like the fire, and it was literally like I ran that place like a science lab because I was like, people say this is what you do, but
Mhm.
I found that wasn't always true. So I'd pray for a kid for maybe a minute, put my hands on them, start praying in tongues, invite the Spirit, and then kids are like, just experience stuff. And it helped me because I still remember one of the girls, she was a freshman. I had said to her, do you want to be baptized in the Holy Spirit? And she was like, no. I said, well, are you okay if I pray for you? And she's like, yeah. And I put my hands and started praying for her. And she felt electricity flying through her body. And she's like, that for her was like the monumental change in her life when she realized this stuff was real.
Mhm.
And even to the point like 6 months later, like a lot of kids are speaking in tongues, light language. And I remember this girl came who was like big old volleyball player, um, just kind of like, but also like kind of terrified, like, what are these weirdos praying in tongues and light language doing? But then she was also like, well, if this is real, I want it. And she was like, but I don't know you. I don't want you to touch me. And I just started laughing. And I was like, hey, I get it. Like she was new to our youth group. So I said to this girl, Kendall, the one that felt the electricity, I go, Kendall, you put your hand on her. I'm going to pray. I'm going to touch you. Because I was like, science lab, right? And I was like, so I prayed. I put my hand on Kendall. Kendall's feeling the electricity go through her. And then that girl is like hearing tongues in her head. And she's like, this is wild. What is, and I was like, are you hearing in your head? She goes, yeah. I go, just speak it out. And she's like, but don't look at me. Like a high school kid. Like, she's like, don't look at me. And I go, okay. And she's like, you know, and praying, like not the same way I do, but in a different way.
Mhm.
But it was like, again, experiential thing. And that was the beauty of like I was always like, well, it's in the Bible, like what this should work. And the kids, like all of them, it was happening very, very quickly. It was like out of 100 kids, there was probably one that didn't have the experience. Because again, they're open and they didn't have a lot of baggage of like, oh, I'm not
Yeah.
good enough. I'm not, I mean, they're kids, so they're insecure, but when it came to spiritual things, they're like, and occasionally there was a kid who faked it, but that's where discernment comes in, where I'd pull them aside afterwards and go, hey, you're not in trouble. I just have the feeling that nothing really happened and you just kind of wanted it to happen. And they were like, yeah. Or sometimes kids, when it came to prophecy or intuitive readings, that would also happen where they felt this pressure to perform. And I was like, guys, there's no pressure.
Hmm.
And once they got that broken off of them, then it was like just easy. So
Hmm.
that's kind of a wide variety. So when it comes to the metaphysical world, I've been learning a bit about how all this stuff works. It was actually one of the practitioners. I'm just being me, right? And I was doing a teaching, and I didn't think about it because in the church world, I'll be talking and I'll be teaching, and sometimes I just go shakarecita and I'll start because I know there's energy flowing, and I didn't think about it, but I did it. And this woman Sheila, she's like, she says to me afterwards, she goes, Matt, I didn't know you prayed in light language. And I was like, what's light language? Like I did because I didn't know.
Yeah.
And she goes, when you started praying, your whole aura lit up and I saw this and this and this and this. And I was like, oh. And then it was funny because in August, I had prayed with a person at my table. If you're not familiar with expos, people come to your table for a reading, healing, different things. And this woman sits down, and all I can feel like here is this tremendous anxiety. And again, I don't think about right, wrong, or whatever. Um, and I just, I said, "Hey, do you want to get rid of the anxiety?" And she goes, "Yeah." And I go, "Is it okay if I put my hand on your shoulder?" And she goes, "Yeah." And I don't even think about it. I put my hand on her shoulder and I start like, "Shakara sitara," I command this anxiety to go. And I'm praying in light language tongues. And this is before Sheila told me, dude, that's light language. The woman's anxiety just left like that. And she goes, were you praying in tongues? And I go, because I always felt like I was in trouble. I was like, yeah. And she goes, I've heard that before in a church. Like, she's like, I went to a church like 30 years ago. But I was like, I'm just kind of trying to figure out how this all works in both communities.
Yeah.
But I've had a lot of practitioners that are like really, really helpful to be like, oh, yeah, it's the same thing, even though some people in the religious world would be like, no, it's not. But in many cases it is. And that's
Hmm.
what I figured out teaching these kids, because I'd have kids that didn't have any religious background and they would come in and they'd be able to pray for healing and they would be able to get filled with the Holy Spirit, church language stuff, that it didn't fit in the Christian religious box that some people
Hmm.
have. So yeah, it's wild, but that's my tongues light language experience,
What
and it's
prompted you? Oh, go
what's
ahead.
that?
I was going to say, what prompted you to start to, I guess, interact with more with the metaphysical world, like to have that, to explore that?
So over the years, as you can imagine, I mean, I wrote a book called The Seer, and in the church world, that pigeonholed me into a certain community of people who can see in the church world. And like, I would have people come up to me and be like, "Hey, so these fairies came out of the wood and climbed into my car. Um, can you explain that from a biblical perspective?" And I'm like, that's not in the Bible." Um, or like people would just have these wild experiences and they would always somehow find me. And this even happened before I knew really anything. Like I would have coaching clients that would be like, yeah, I saw this crazy razor blade flying through my house, try to kill me. And I'd just be like, oh, sounds like fun. Like, and I would figure out what it was. But it was like in the Christian religious world, people all have these, like, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of people have these wild experiences and they're looking for answers.
Hmm.
And people who are not like me, they don't really know what to say.
Hmm.
And so they're like, they think the person's crazy. And end up finding those people. Or in Europe, they call it esoteric people that end up becoming Catholic, and they're like, well, can I still do the same stuff I was doing before? They like have all these questions. I was, well, did anybody like, is it bad? They're like, no. And I'm like, well, then who told you you couldn't do it? And they're like, well, nobody. I just for some reason thought I couldn't do it. And I'm like, do you have character integrity? Are you trying to honor like people, like just that whole kind of thing?
Hmm.
um that's kind of how a lot of this has happened, where in I've been working with people like myself for years, like even before all this kind of wild stuff was just like a regular situation, but I didn't understand it. Like 20 years ago, I'm doing coaching and I have somebody who like they need deliverance and I don't even know what that is or how to do it. And they're like, I'm like, well, how did you find me? And they're like, oh, this person, I don't know what their name is. And I'm like, I'm just like hearing this crazy story. It was all preparation for
Hmm.
where I am now. And so to get to the metaphysical thing, I've always like, I get along with everybody. I've always enjoyed like just spiritual people in general.
Hmm.
And, and I could tell you stories where we had people with bad intentions come to church. I could tell you stories of people showing up in the spirit realm to try to kill me, like just crazy stuff that most people don't ever experience. Um, but I always knew that, sometimes people get polarized and think it's just good and bad. They don't
Hmm.
realize there's kind of in betweens. But it was like, I had I've always had the heart to connect with psychics, seers, whatever you want to call them, and then especially writing a book on it. I was always curious, like, what does somebody who's never been to a church or hasn't been to a church since they were a little kid think of like what I've written about? And I knew they would like it because it's like that's how they were born as well. They just ended up in a different direction. So I
Hmm.
saw like an ad on Facebook for an event and I was like, well, it just happened to be free, which is rare on a weekend because I have kids, play sports, all that kind of stuff. And so I went to this event and I just played dumb. And I purposely told people I was a pastor because I knew that as soon as you tell people a pastor, they start talking down to you. Even
Hmm.
if you're on a plane, if somebody says, oh, what do you do for a living? Like, I'm like, oh my gosh. I just tell them I run a nonprofit or I'm a teacher or something because people are polarized, right?
Hmm.
And they have their idea of what a title even means.
Hmm.
So I'll be like, I cast demons out of people. So, um, but what was my point? I just lost myself when I thought of that.
Oh, you went to the MeWe fair
Oh
and
yeah,
you were just playing dumb. Yeah.
yeah. So it was actually the BEPC, and so
Oh,
I
okay.
just they had like a panel, and I just stood up in the audience, and it was my turn. They let me ask a question. I just played really dumb, and I go, how should I use my gifts, right? And that's when you kind of like had no idea who I was, no nothing, and then everybody kind of took their turn, and it was really funny. There was this one woman who who said some things that were really spot on, and it was funny because she just looked at me. I'm not joking for like 5 minutes afterwards, like just kept staring at me. They moved on to like two other people, and it was really funny because I was like, "Oh, that woman's really powerful." I was like, "And why is she staring at me?" And there was like people in between. I actually did this because I was like, "Is she just looking at me in the spirit, or is she looking at me, looking at me?" And I was like, "Oh, she's looking at me." And later on, when I got to know her, I said, "Do you remember me?" She goes, "Oh yeah." But it was fun because I was able to just kind of go around, play dumb, went to a bunch of different things, listen to people teach, and
Hmm.
just act like I don't know anything and see kind of what people could really do and what people could really um experience. So that was just fun. That was kind of my first thing, and I called a couple of friends that were open to this and they came as well. And I had the thought of like, I wonder what would happen if I started doing like the healing stuff, and in the church we call it the prophetic, like if I
Hmm.
started doing readings, like, and I wondered, like, are these people actually even any good at doing healing or psychic, they call it psychic readings or intuitive
Yeah.
readings. That was my curious. So I was just like open to see what can people really do. And then that led, I just one step by the step and, after another. And then I'm like, I talked to this woman who runs MeWe, and I was like, hey, so what? Because I was like, number one, do people make money doing this? Do people actually help people? And
Hmm.
then how do you do it? And then everybody was like super like helpful to like, yeah, just do this and this and this. And so I was like, well, I think that was like November, somewhere like in there. So it wasn't even until August that I actually did my first event, because there was a bunch of other stuff in between, different travel stuff. And but I was like, yeah, we'll see what happens and give it a shot. So yeah.
Awesome. So for people that are listening and are feel intrigued and want to work with you in some capacity, what are some of the different ways in which they can do that?
I mean, the easiest way to find me is website newcastleoracle.com.
Hmm.
Have a little bit of my story and the different things that I offer like on there. And then I've just been doing MeWe events around Oregon and Washington so far. Um, where I'll do usually a couple free events. Last couple things I've taught on light language, angels, how to set them up kind of in a structure around your place for safety, protection, understanding who your guardian angel is, all that kind of stuff. But I'm just kind of trying to test things out to see, does this even work in the metaphysical community? And I'm finding out like actually it's kind of fun because most people know how to meditate. It's like
Hmm.
it's like really really quick to help people
Hmm.
to get going. So I've already started mentoring people on how I do healing and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's impossible to say, oh, these are all the things I do over 30 years of, this kind of work.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm the person that it's like I'm not satisfied with just being able to do it. I wanted to like deconstruct how does it actually work? And
Hmm.
then also, because I was in a church where it was literally the who's who of the zoo, every famous minister around the world came in there, that like lady that went invisible, people that have like floated in the air, like if you can think it, it's happened, like people being raised from the dead. um, and I led a supernatural school for a year while I was there, where I was teaching people how to do this stuff. And then also, like, I'd be like, guest speaker would come in to teach. I'd be like, so have you ever seen a purple dragon? You know, because I'm the guy that sees a purple dragon flying over the church, breathing fire. That doesn't really work in most churches. Most churches would be like, this guy's something's wrong with him. Let's get him out. But this church was like, hey, awesome. You know, so sorry, newcastleoracle.com is the easiest way to reach
No,
me.
that's good. I Because I'm sure as people are listening to there, the idea of if you want to come get a reading from Matt at one of the MeWe fairs, or you could reach out to him independently, but also the classes that you teach, I think are a great opportunity to come um, to check it out in a group setting too. I
Yeah,
could
and if
definitely
people
see doing something with you in Everett that some of the local people could come to around Everett as well. But for
yeah.
people who live outside the state, um, there's also opportunities there. I think the part that I really appreciate too about meeting you, and now I've had the opportunity to go to at least two of your sessions, and I've had a one-on-one session with you. Um, is I think for me, my journey with the church and not understanding why people put things in boxes, because I've always just felt such a strong love for humans, period, that I've never understood feeling excluded. And there were certain things that when I found the metaphysical community, I was like, why does this feel like home? And I've never felt that feeling of home when I've entered a church. Um, Granted, I've felt like a lot of people I've met in the church are beautiful, wonderful, amazing souls. So I don't know, I like the way that you talk about it, because I think it brings these communities together, which just that is what feels right and what feels, I don't know, harmonious to me.
And I mean, and if I could say it, I'm the bridge between both worlds. Even to me, there's not much separation.
Hmm.
But it's like people have separation just about they're polarized about so much stuff. But it's like I'm
Hmm.
literally have my foot in both worlds,
Hmm.
and I'm fine. I can talk in the church
Hmm.
world, quote the Bible, and then I can switch to the metaphysical, and
Yeah.
so much of it is the same thing.
Hmm.
And that's where I've loved a lot of my new friends that I've met at these fairs, is like just being able to ask questions and answer things. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is the same thing. It's just a,
Hmm.
you know. different, maybe a different way to say it or
Hmm.
whatever.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've talked a lot about on the podcast too, is just recognizing in my life that oftentimes it was the way somebody defined a particular word. It was the vocabulary, it was the word and the definition and how they used it. That was the difference. And I remember when I learned that, I was like, oh my God, people have all these arguments and all these disagreements, and they're talking about the same thing. They're just using the word differently, or they're not understanding each other. So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
a simple thing is when I go minister in the church world, they call me a prophet. And most
Hmm.
people would have no idea what that means other than there's a fivefold ministry and one of the main gifts is a prophet and a prophet does these kind of certain things. And then in the metaphysical world it's like, well, you got to call yourself a psychic because of that's what it's like similar thing, different title. But
Hmm.
even in that, like I don't want to be called either one. I just like
Hmm.
I would always just be like, yeah, my name's Matt. Like
Hmm.
I can do stuff. I have lots of stories and I can help you do stuff. That's, because most what I experience, I don't know about the metaphysical world yet, but in the church world, there's a lot of people with titles who can't do anything.
Hmm.
That's what I discovered. And some of them are very famous. And God bless them.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's the same in any industry or world that I've gone into, is that there, and that's where the discernment plays in, which there are just a lot of people who either get caught up in their ego or they're just unaware and don't, you have to discern who's someone that's actually going to be able to serve you, and do they have the gifts that they think they have, or what have you. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's been the fun thing of like metaphysical world. The first time I did a healing event, I was like, well, hope this works. I have no idea whether it's going to work in this community or not. I mean, I kind of thought I would, but
Yeah.
I'm like, all right, let's try it out. And then first event, I started a new YouTube, Newcastle Oracle, on YouTube, and this woman shared her testimony. 20 years of all these diagnoses is gone in like 5 minutes of just putting my hand on her, praying, and just
Hmm.
completely like crazy healing. So yeah, lots
Amazing.
of wild stuff. Guess what? It works everywhere.
It does. Well, thank you so much for just sharing all your stories with us and sharing who you are. I really appreciate it. And I know that the people that listen are going to really enjoy this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun, and it's been good to get to know you in person and then through this.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I always end each episode with, what's your current I love it when for the world or for yourself right now?
I mean, mine is really, really simple.
Love it.
I'm the person that just can't stop talking about my kids and my family. Like I love it when I get to be with my family. That's for me, like that's the thing. And so that then
Hmm.
pours into everything I do because if you're mentoring somebody, in many cases it is similar to raising kids. It is similar to like just being a part of a family. And that's the fun part is like I have people that are I would call them family. When I go to
Hmm.
Austria, there's literally people that I'm like they're closer to me than some of the people biologically that I
Hmm.
like when I go there I go see 30 of my best friends. Like that's not an exaggeration, and that's how the metaphysical world is starting to happen for me is there's people that I'm like, yeah, these people I can tell are going to be family because
Hmm.
they're genuine, they're honest, they're open, and they want to
Hmm.
grow. And to me that's the thing of like I'm a lifelong learner, love being a dad. That's like it's what I like. What do you want to do when you grow up? I want to be a dad. Like that was my thing. So
Oh, I love it. Well, thank you.
yeah.